All right, greetings, good evening, and welcome everyone. My name is Peter Tierney. I'm a program coordinator in science and religion with the Lumen Christi Institute. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Institute, we're a Catholic nonprofit institute here in Hyde Park dedicated to engaging the university with the depth and breadth of the Catholic intellectual tradition. And we're very excited to be hosting Professor Daniel Fairbanks here today to speak on the life and legacy of Gregor Mendel. This July marked the 200th birthday of Mendel and offers us great opportunity to reflect on his legacy. And of course, his P experiment is one of the most widely known experiments ever conducted. It's taught in biology classrooms all across the world. But the importance of those studies can't be understated. They helped establish the laws of inheritance and set the stage for the development of the field of genetics. Moreover, when combined with the works of Charles Darwin, clarified fundamental questions in evolution in what is called the modern synthesis. You can't tell the story of modern biology without Mendel. But Mendel was not just a scientist, but also an Augustinian friar, a Catholic priest in a community of like-minded religious, whose lived vocations deeply valued education and promoted work even in the secular sciences. And as such, we have a prime example of a scientist who not only found little conflict between science and his faith, but one whose faith complemented his work beautifully. Now, before I continue, I must give particular acknowledgement to our co-sponsors, the Morris Fishbein Center for the History of Science and Medicine, and the Seminary Co-op Bookstore, which will have copies of Professor Fairbanks' book, Gregor Mendel, His Life and Legacy, for purchase afterwards. So this program is also made possible through the support of a grant number 62372 from the John Templeton Foundation, called Illumine, supporting the Catholic intellectual tradition on campuses nationwide. So on with the show. Daniel Fairbanks is professor of biology and university research officer at Utah Valley University. He's a geneticist specializing in the history of genetics, evolutionary genetics, plant genetics and breeding, and international scientific development. He is also one of the foremost contemporary scholars of Gregor Mendel. His books and articles have worked to dispel pervasive Mendelian myths, clarify the influence of Darwin on Mendel, and bring to light new evidence of Mendel's scientific discovery and influence. He's the author or co-author of 6 scholarly books and many scientific articles, and his most recent book, as I mentioned just recently, is a new biography, Gregor Mendel, His Life and Legacy, published by Prometheus Books. For his contributions to the study of Mendel, he received the 2017 Mendel Memorial Medal from the Mendelianum, is that how you pronounce it? In Brno, where Mendel lived and conducted his famous experiments. And finally, Dr. Fairbanks is also an accomplished artist with sculpture, paintings, and drawings in museums, public and private collections in the United States, Latin America, and Europe. And just recently, when he was in Brno, presented them with a new it's a painting of Gregor Mendel 2 weeks ago, which is now going to be kind of permanently displayed in the abbey in which he lived and worked.
I'll show it.
Oh, you'll show it very soon. Okay. Well, on that, I want to invite Dr. Fairbanks up for Gregor Mendel at his Bicentennial, highlights of his life and legacy.
Thank you. It is a great honor to be here, and I'm grateful for the invitation to give this presentation. This year is just a remarkable year, being the bicentennial of Gregor Mendel's birth. We are revisiting his life and his legacy and what he has accomplished this past July for his birthday in the Czech Republic. Had a wonderful festival with over 2,000 people in attendance. And I'll show you a few photographs of some of this. So as Peter mentioned, I recently had the privilege of publishing a new biography of Mendel. Also as an artist, I had one of the advantages of being an artist is that I illustrate my own books. And so some of the illustrations I'll show you in the presentation today are some of my artwork. And that came from growing up in a family of artists. My father, my great-grandfather, or my father, my grandfather, great-grandfather, a couple of uncles and great-uncles, all were professional artists as their careers, and so I grew up in that kind of environment. As Peter mentioned, I was recently commissioned to paint oil portraits of Gregor Mendel and his 2 surviving sisters. Theresia and Veronica illustrated here, and down below it shows them in the museum. Those were unveiled 2 weeks ago today in Brno. And then this is Augustinian monastery or friary where Mendel lived, which is now once again a functioning monastery. It was turned over, not turned over, but taken over by the state during communism. But in 1989, with the fall of communism, was turned back to the Roman Catholic Church and to the Augustinians, who continue to use it as a functioning monastery. I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge Dr. Anna Montalova, who greeted me back in 1993 when I first went to the museum and the monastery where Mendel lived. She has facilitated my research over all these years and been a true friend. I was very honored to help edit her most recent book, Gregor Mendel, the Scientist, which is mostly a visual book with images of documents that the museum owns that are related to Mendel, along with explanations and translations. So let's begin with Mendel's, as we should, with Mendel's birth in 1822. He was born in the town of what was then known as Heinzendorf in German, now is Hinčice in the Czech Republic, very close to the Polish border. This is a landscape painting that I did of his birth home, where he lived during his childhood years. And then, as I mentioned, he had 4 sisters, 2 of whom died very young, one as a toddler and one just a few weeks after birth. And the 2 sisters represented here, Veronica and Theresia, lived to adulthood, and Theresia lived into the 20th century, long enough to see her brother attain worldwide recognition. Young Johann Mendel, he took on Gregor when he joined the priesthood. He attended a number of schools. This first one is a schoolhouse that is just steps from his birthplace, and but the local priest was the teacher, and he recognized just how precocious this young man was, and recommended that his parents send him away to boarding school, which was a great sacrifice for the family, but they nonetheless did so. And Johann himself, in fact, had to work as a tutor to support himself, which put him under so much strain that twice he had to retreat home because of severe nervous breakdowns. But at age 11, he studied at the Menieres Monastery in Leipzig, and then the Troppau Gymnasium from ages 12 to 19, and then the Olmütz Philosophical Institute ages 19 to 21. And it was at the completion of his studies at the Olmütz Philosophical Institute when one of his teachers strongly recommended that he join the priesthood and become an Augustinian friar, and that professor in fact wrote a very strong letter for him that was so strong that the abbot of the monastery accepted Mendel without even the customary interview. So he entered the Augustinian St. Thomas Monastery in what was then known as the city of Brunn, but also Brno. I'm pronouncing it in German and Czech, and it was in fact an ethnic German-Czech city at the time. And Mendel was ethnic German, but he ended up learning Czech as he progressed through life. And this is the monastery. I've painted it here to be as it appeared at the time. During World War II, an Allied bomb hit that foremost part of the monastery and destroyed it. And it has since been built out now, so it looks very different. But you can also see Mendels Greenhouse down in the foreground, and his garden was right in front of the greenhouse. If you look very closely, I tried to paint purple and white flowered pea plants in the garden. He was very fortunate to join an extraordinary community of scholars who were very well advanced. In fact, the abbot, Cyril Knapp, who is seated in the front with the abbatial cross, pectoral cross, was himself a linguist, historian, and philosopher. And then I pointed out several others in here who were Bratronic, Klossel, and Krzyzkowski, who were very well advanced scholars, two of them philosophers, and then Krzyzewski was a musician. And Krzyzewski was especially influential because he trained the young composer Leos Janáček, who was one of the most famous of Czech composers, who lived in the monastery at the same time as Mendel, and in fact conducted the requiem and played the organ for Mendel's funeral. Mendel's nervous breakdowns came back to haunt him. He was assigned to be a parish priest, but in serving people who were sick or infirm, he couldn't manage it and he would have to retreat to his own bed because of these nervous breakdowns. And the abbot recognized that, as he put it in a letter, he said he's less fitted for work as a parish priest, the reason being that he is seized with an unconquerable timidity when he has to visit a sick bed or see anyone ill or in pain. And the abbot is using this as justification to reassign Mendel as a teacher instead of as a parish priest, which is very obvious from Mendel's letters. He was very happy with this assignment. He went to teach first at the Zoinmo Gymnasium, which is now very close to the Czech-Austrian border. However, he had to certify as a teacher, and so he took the certification examination and failed it. It was actually kind of a partial success, partial failure, and that ended up being fortuitous because that prompted both his examiners, who were professors at the University of Vienna, and his abbot to recommend that he study for 2 years at the University of Vienna. And so that's where we turn our attention now. From the years 1851 to 53, Mendel studied. He was supposed to study for only a year, but it ended up being almost 2 years that he studied at the University of Vienna. And he was fortunate to be there at a time when some of the finest scientists of the 19th century were there at the university. And I'm only going to highlight 3 of them. He had quite interactions with quite a number of them. But you may have all heard of the famous physicist Christian Doppler, after whom the Doppler effect is named. He was Mendel's very first professor. And Mendel studied in 2 classes with Doppler. And then unfortunately, Doppler's health took a dramatic change for the worst, and he died. So Mendel was one of Doppler's last students. Another very influential professor was Andreas von Ettingshausen, who was the expert in the German-speaking world on combinatorial mathematics and had written a textbook on the topic. And Mendel took combinatorial mathematics from Ettingshausen, so he was taking it from the world's foremost expert. That's the type of mathematics he applied to his famous experiments. And so these physics and mathematics courses that he took at the University of Vienna had a profound influence on him and led him to a type of experimentation and interpretation that truly was novel for that period of time. The other very influential professor was Franz Unger. Unger was an evolutionary biologist and botanist, and at the time Mendel was in Vienna, Unger published 2 popular books on evolution. And you have to look at the years here. This is 1851 to 53, so it predates Darwin's Origin of Species, which was first published in English in 1859. But if you read Unger's work, he's teaching what we now call Darwinian evolution, pre-Darwinian. And Mendel was studying with him at this time. This lists his classes. I won't go through them, but you can see he took 4 in physics, 3 in chemistry, 2 in mathematics, 4 in botany, 2 in zoology, and 1 in paleontology. And it gives you some sense of the breadth of this extraordinary education that he had in Vienna. Unfortunately, we only have 2 letters from Mendel, both of them one to his family and one to a fellow friar, that say nothing about what he was studying. But based on records, we have a good idea of what was going on in Vienna at the time. And I'd like to highlight just a few of those. I mentioned Unger. These images that you see in the middle are from his book depicting the various geological periods over millions of years, with hand-tinted lithographs in a big folio format of a book that was intended to be kind of a coffee table type book for the general public. And at the time, Unger presented what were called magic lantern shows, which were the predecessors of a PowerPoint slideshow. These were glass slides in wooden frames that were illuminated in theaters with limelight. And interestingly, as part of the research for this book, we stumbled across these two slides, which are at Worcester College in Ohio. And the college did not know that those were Unger's slides and that they were related to Mendel. And so this book brought those that discovery together. Also, I've indicated here Sebastian Brunner, who was a priest in Vienna who was Unger's enemy. And Mendel was obviously in an awkward position, being a Catholic priest studying with an evolutionary biologist, with Brunner, writing articles at the time Mendel was there in the local paper, criticizing Unger. Then I also mentioned Eddingshausen's specialty in combinatorial mathematics, Mendel's courses with Doppler's death, and then the respect that Mendel gained is evident in the fact that he was elected to the Imperial Royal Zoological Botanical Society in Vienna. And sometimes it's said that his famous paper on peas was his first and only paper. That's not true. His first two scientific publications were in the Journal of this Society, and he presented to them published in 1853 and 1854. And so now let's turn to his classic experiments, which constitute his third publication. And this is an image from the handwritten version of the manuscript showing the mathematical approach that Mendel took. Now, he conducted preliminary experiments in 1854 to 55, and during this time he purchased 34 pea varieties, ultimately chose 22. And then there are some wonderful writings that I just examined 2 weeks ago, where in the back of a book, he wrote, you can see him trying to decide which characters to study. He ultimately settled on 7, which are illustrated photographically here, and I'll illustrate them momentarily with paintings. But interestingly, he after conducting his experiments, which took place between 1856 and 1863, he then prepared his manuscript for presentation to the Natural Science Society in Brunn. But I'd like to go to the presentation just before Mendel's. These were monthly presentations, one per month. And so the January 1865 presentation was by Mendel's friend and collaborator, Alexander Mikowski, who presented it on Darwin's theory of organic creation. And so the presentation that immediately predated Mendel's at the Society was all on Darwin's Origin of Species, and very positive in promoting it. And in fact, Mikowski highlighted certain passages which interestingly correspond to some degree with passages that Mendel marked in his personal copy of Origin of Species, which I'll visit in just a moment. So as I mentioned, Mendel chose 7 pairs of characteristics that are illustrated in these paintings that are very distinct either-or sort of characteristics in peas. He looked at others that showed a continuous variation and stated that they were not amenable to the experiments because of the interpretation that the experimenter would have to make in trying to determine what was what. But he correctly concluded that the same principles of inheritance that apply to these discrete characters also apply to continuous variation, which was then experimentally confirmed early in the 20th century. And he began with what we call monohybrid experiments, where he picked varieties that differed in only one of these 7 characteristics, but were the same for the other 6. The idea being to exclude the possibility of the influence of the inheritance of one on the other. And these show some of his results of these experiments, starting off. And what's important, we usually think of this 3-to-1 ratio, which is based on dominance, but Mendel continues his experiments to try to figure out what was going on in the underlying inheritance, so that if you look down in this part, you'll see that he starts off with it being 1 to 2 to 1, which is the 3-to-1 broken down into what we now call the genotypic ratio. And I think that's important to recognize because it gives a symmetrical ratio that as the number of characters increases, it increases exponentially the number of combinations, but begins to approach what we call a normal curve, or sometimes called the bell curve, and we'll see that now. So he reported one experiment on seed shape and seed color, and these are the observations that he made in what he called the first generation from the hybrids, and then he carried it another generation so that he could determine what was happening in the underlying genetic constitution. And you can see again, notice the symmetry in the ratios. 1 to 2 to 2 to 4 to 2 to 2 to 1 to 1. And then he continued on with 3 characters combined. And there I won't take the time to describe the symmetrical ratio, but it's still there. It's just that there are 64 possible combinations for ways that can show here. And Mendel showed that in fact his observations were in accordance with this prediction. And that's where he ended his first lecture. And so I've included here some of the conclusions that he drew. One is that the progeny of hybrids in which severally essentially differing characteristics are united represent the terms of a combination series. Notice that he's talking in terms of combinatorial mathematics. And also that constant characters occurring in different forms of a plant genus can, through repeated artificial fertilization, occur in all possible combinations according to the rules of combination. And so that's the conclusion he drew. He was just looking at his observations and the mathematical patterns that were there. Then in the second lecture that he gave on March 8th, 1865, he derived a momentous theory to describe these, a theory that remains pretty much unchanged today, which is one of the reasons why in biology classes we always teach Mendels Experiments. That he derived a theory of inheritance that is one of the most enduring theories in science. And yet we often don't give Mendel credit for one of the discoveries that he considered to be the most important. At the time, scientists were debating how fertilization took place, and there was a very strong faction of scientists who argued that inheritance was purely paternal or predominantly paternal. And Unger, interestingly, was one of those who argued that it was equal. And Mendel's other botany professor, Fenzel, argued that it was uniparental paternal, and that the maternal parent served only as metaphorically the oven to bake the bread, sort of thing. That it was or as he put it, as a nurse. And but Unger was arguing for equality in inheritance, and Mendel derived purely from his mathematical results, derived this conclusion, which he considered to be one of the most important discoveries. One germ cell and one pollen cell unite into a single cell that is able to develop into an independent organism through the uptake of matter and the formation of new cells. This development takes place according to a constant law founded in the material nature and arrangement of the elements. And I think that statement, if there's anything that really encapsulates Mendel's theory, this is it. Because not only is he showing the equal union of the germ cell and a pollen cell, or the equivalent of an egg cell and sperm cell in animals and humans, to form what we now call the zygote. But notice that he also recognizes that the hereditary material has a material nature. It is a chemical substance, and has a law that governs the arrangement of the elements. And the elements he's referring to here are not the chemical elements, but rather the hereditary elements that we would now call genes. There are some people who claim that Mendel didn't perceive of genes. I argue the reverse of that when he used the word elements 10 times in his paper, he was referring to what we now call genes. And it's pretty clear from his paper that is the case. And then he also included a long footnote that resolved this debate absolutely. And I won't read it here, but it essentially is saying that his results can only be explained by one germ cell and one pollen cell uniting to form a single cell. Some historians have claimed that the laws of segregation and independent assortment that we usually attribute to Mendel are not to be found in his paper. In fact, they are found in his paper toward the end. If you focus just on the beginning of the paper, they're not as obvious, but toward the end, they are very clear. And this is one passage here. I won't read through the whole thing, but notice the yellow part highlighted there. Only the differing ones, meaning the elements, reciprocally segregate themselves. Now, this is from a translation that Scott Abbott and I made in 2016 and published. Other researchers have used other translators have used the word separate rather than segregate. But interestingly, there is ample evidence to indicate that segregate is an appropriate term there. And then for independent assortment, this one, I think, there are several places in Mendel's paper that have independent assortment, but this is one of the best. The behavior of each pair of differing characters in hybrid union is independent of the other differences between the two original plants, and further, the hybrid produces as many types of germ pollen cells as there are possible constant combination forms. Again, you can see the combinatorial mathematics coming into this. So Mendel's laws of segregation and independent assortment are clearly there in his paper and what he perceived. So I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about Mendel and Darwin. The two were contemporaries, and there's been a lot of speculation about what did they know about each other. And it's very clear that Mendel knew of Darwin. In fact, he owned a copy of Origin of Species and read it. But also good evidence that Darwin knew nothing about Mendel. And so some of my research has focused on Darwin's influence on Mendel. And a lot of it, what really clued me into this was when I first visited the monastery, Dr. Matalova allowed me to examine Mendel's copy of Origin of Species, and I photographed Mendel's annotations in it, and then we ended up publishing those. But this one in particular is the only passage that Mendel marked with double lines. He marked them on the left-hand margin there. And in fact, let me go to this slide right here. This is the same one down here at the bottom showing those double lines. And if you look at it, there's this term right here. These are two passages that he marked, Lebensbedingungen, which is usually translated as living conditions. But if we go back to Darwin's original English, this term is conditions of life, which is quintessentially Darwinian. Darwin used it 107 times in Origin of Species. And so that made me wonder, is this Darwin's influence on Mendel where we see these terms? So one of the things that we did is we went through an online version or an electronic version of the German edition that Mendel used, and color-coded all of the key terms that matched key terms in Mendel's paper, and we color-coded those green unless it was in a passage that Mendel marked. And if it was in a passage that Mendel marked, we colored it yellow, and then went to Mendel's paper and to see what we could find, and the result was really quite astounding. Toward the beginning of his paper, it's mostly green. In other words, words not that are German words that correspond with the words that are in the translation. But as we get toward the end of the paper, it suddenly starts turning very yellow. This is from Mendel's paper. In other words, Mendel toward the end of the paper is using terms from the passages that he marked in Origin of Species. And there you can see his two uses of Lebensbedingungen in it. And then these are some other words that he used for the first time in this passage, even though he used cognate words earlier in the paper. And this is very close to the end of his paper. This particular paragraph, by the way, sounds very Darwinian. In fact, we were not the first ones to notice that. Sir Ronald Fisher, the famed statistician, said the reflection of Darwin's thought is unmistakable. And he's absolutely right, it is. And this color coding really underscores that observation. Well, Mendel was not content to presume that his that the results he had found were universal, just from peas and beans. And so he initiated a series of other experiments to develop, actually, not so much to confirm what he observed in the pea and bean plants, but to develop a more comprehensive theory of hybridization and heredity. And one of the plants, and he even wrote in a letter, a final determination will result only when detailed experiments of the most diverse plant families are available. Now, it's often said that he worked with a plant called hawkweed, genus name is Hyracium, and that he was attempting to confirm his experiments with this plant, but was incredibly frustrated because he didn't know it, but the plant it inherits its genes through apomixis, meaning it inherits them only from the maternal parent. Interestingly, just the reverse of what Fenzel, his professor, had proposed. But in fact, if we go to the letters that Mendel wrote about this, he suspected that Hyracium would not follow those laws. He wasn't sure, but he intentionally chose plants that he suspected might follow some different laws to develop a comprehensive theory. Unfortunately, quite a number of people have said this was a horrible disappointment to him, or a worst possible choice, a completely misguided choice, and the results were a mess. That's not the case. He obtained true hybrids from them and was able himself to develop a more broad theory of inheritance by studying Hyracium. But the other point is that he didn't study just Hyracium. He studied 20 other genera of plants. And he, in fact, did confirm in at least 3 of them that the inheritance was the same as it was in the pea plant. And so he did have a confirmation of it. And so really the only unfortunate aspect of this is that Mendel left much of this unpublished. And in fact, that's one of the questions: why didn't he publish these? And his nephew recalled that Mendel said often to us nephews that we shall find at his heritage papers for publication that he could not publish during his life, but we did not receive anything from the cloister, not even a thing for remembrance. And then a fellow friar recalled that at Mendel's death, most of his papers were committed to the flames. And so, all of this wonderful research, which we only know about because of Mendel's letters to Carl von Nageli, who was a botanist. So Mendel was elected abbot in 1868. It's sometimes said that he ceased his experiments at that time. That's not correct. He continued his experiments, very extensive experiments, through 1873. And unfortunately, we do not have much of Mendel's religious writings. What's interesting is to look at his scientific writings. Although he was an Augustinian friar, he took a very modern scientific approach, focusing purely on science in his scientific writings. But we do have some fragments of his of 2 Easter sermons, and I'd like to just read part of them here because it gives a sense of his religious devotion, but also the fact that in his sermons he's relying on the imagery of plants and soil, similar to what he had done experimentally. The gardener plants seedlings in prepared soil. The soil must exert a physical and chemical influence so that the seed of the plant can grow. Yet this is not sufficient. The warmth and light of the sun must be added together with rain for growth to result. The seed of supernatural life, of sanctifying grace, cleanses from sin, so preparing the soul who must seek to preserve this life by good works. Thus the natural and the supernatural must unite to bring about holiness. Mendel's abbacy, unfortunately, though, was not as wonderful and spiritual as these sermons represent. He was very obstinate in fighting against taxation of church property, to the point that he developed a lot of enemies, and in fact had the Austrian government impose a lien on the monastery income. And in one of his encounters with the Lord Lieutenant, the Lord Lieutenant stated that physical measures would have been needed to put the warrant in execution. The prelate, having declared that municipal officers would have themselves to take the keys out of his pocket if they wanted to open the cash box, and would have to use force to remove any property for sale. And he held to this firmly through his until his death, and then at his death, the procurator of the monastery reevaluated the property, and the lien was released, and everything was fine after that. But Mendel was very obstinate in that sense. He died on January 6, 1884, at the age of 62. His funeral was held in the Basilica of the Assumption of the Virgin Mary, which I had the privilege of speaking in this past July. It's a wonderful Gothic 14th century cathedral. And Leos Janáček, who's illustrated here, as I mentioned earlier, played the organ and conducted the Requiem. And then Mendel was buried in a tomb here, which interestingly, just a year ago, his remains were exhumed and his genome sequenced, as well as archaeological and anthropological work done by Masaryk University in Brno. And in another lecture, I could take some time to describe that, but there will be an NPR story coming out on it soon. Fast forward to the year 1900, and we have the dramatic Mendelian rediscovery. Mendel wasn't entirely ignored during his lifetime and after his death, but no one, including Mendel himself, recognized the import of his research. And then three botanists, not knowing of Mendel, although there's some evidence that they might have known of Mendel. Correns, in fact, probably knew about him at the time he was conducting the experiments. But they conducted experiments that were very similar to Mendel's. In fact, Correns and Schermach were working with the pea plant using the same characters that Mendel was looking at, pea shape and seed color. And they ended up seeing the same patterns of inheritance and derived the same conclusions as Mendel, and then having discovered that Mendel had published these earlier, attributed those to Mendel. But the two who really supported Mendelism more than any other and brought Mendel to the forefront was Edith Rebecca Saunders and William Bateson. In fact, interestingly, genetics was, at the time, Saunders was prohibited from obtaining a degree at Cambridge University because women were not allowed to receive degrees. They had instead to receive less prestigious triple certificates. And, but Bateson was very much promoted women in science and recruited, along with Saunders, numerous women, so that genetics was one of the first sciences to have a very large group of women conducting experiments, most of them under the direction of Edith Saunders, who was a consummate scientist, and I wish I could give an entire lecture on her. Bateson promoted Mendelism with almost an evangelism sort of thing, and in the process recruited numerous scientists who conducted experiments in plants, in animals, insects, even humans, and were able to confirm Mendelian inheritance in them. Notably missing was Hugo de Vries, who actually felt that Mendelism was not the rule, but rather the exception. Also at the time, WFR Weldon was very much opposed to Bateson and Mendelism and argued against it. And I wish I could get I've got a little emoji window here that's showing up there. I got it written, cleared out. But Weldon stated that that Mendel's laws do not hold universally for the characters of peas, which he so carefully described, and the fundamental mistake which vitiates all of Mendel's work, or work based on Mendel's method, is the neglect of ancestry. Well, Bateson was incensed, and he published in 1902 a scathing rebuttal of, I think it was about over 100 pages. And in it, you can hear Bateson's vitriol here. Professor Weldon declares that he has no wish to belittle the importance of Mendel's achievement. He desires simply to call attention to a series of facts which seem to him to suggest fruitful lines of inquiry. In this purpose, I venture to assist him, for I am disposed to think that, unaided as he is, to borrow Horace Walpole's phrase, about as likely to light a fire with a wet dishclout as to kindle interest in Mendel's discoveries by his tempered appreciation. You can just hear how this is drenched in sarcasm. And the two of them fought with each other publicly for years over Mendelism until Weldon died unexpectedly in 1906, bringing a very somber end to this controversy. I'd like to jump to another controversy, in part because it reflects on Mendel's legacy in his homeland, and that's Lysenkoism. In the late 1920s and into the 1930s, an obscure scientist named Trofim Lysenko gained prominence by arguing against Mendelism, stating that what he called Mendelism Morganism was the pseudoscience of the West, and he gained Stalin's favor. In fact, I really love this photograph from a newspaper on the left where you can see Lysenko mixing science and politics together under the approving gaze of Joseph Stalin. And the one who promoted Mendelism more than any other was Nikolai Vavilov, who he and his followers knew that they were in peril of imprisonment and death by defending Mendel, and yet they did so anyway. And in one of Vavilov's final presentations, he stated, "We shall go to the pyre, we shall burn, but we shall not retreat from our convictions." And he was true to his word. He was imprisoned shortly after that and died of malnutrition and disease in Saratov prison. You can see the mugshots of him there on the right. But another very touching story is that he collected, based on Mendelian genetics, in an attempt to preserve the genetic diversity of food plants, he collected seeds and tubers from all over the world to preserve the diversity of heirloom varieties, and stored that in what was then Leningrad in what was the equivalent of a museum. And during the horrible siege of Leningrad, I think it was the winter of, what was it, winter of, I'm slipping my mind, 29, I think, 41, 42. Was the siege of Leningrad by the Nazi army. And the scientists, by then Vavilov was in prison, and the scientists who had charge of all of these seeds, the city was starving. Tens of thousands of people starved to death. And here were these scientists surrounded by all of these seeds. Not enough to feed even a fraction of the people in the city, but certainly enough to keep them alive. But they made a pact that they would not eat these seeds, and 9 of them died of starvation voluntarily to protect this valuable resource that they had. And fortunately, Lysenkoism fell in 1965 with the fall of Khrushchev, which was the year that a museum to Mendel was dedicated in the monastery where he lived, and that museum is still there. I feel honored to have my own artwork on display in it. I'd like to end with the Mendel-Fisher controversy, which has been a long, ongoing controversy. It's also one of the areas where I've conducted a substantial amount of research. And I'd put Weldon in parentheses there, because even though he's usually not included, he was the one to first raise the issue. He stated, "Remembering Mendel's shaven crown, I cannot help wondering if his results were too good." Mendel didn't have a shaven crown, by the way. And then he stated that the odds against a result as good as this or better are 20 to 1, implying that it was the data were too good to be true. And then in 1936, Ronald Fisher published a paper in which he wrote the most famous quotation that comes out of it: "The data of most, if not all, of the experiments have been falsified so as to agree closely with Mendel's expectations. Now notice Fisher's intentional use of passive voice here. Fisher was reluctant to attribute it directly to Mendel and speculated that there was an assistant who had done so. And in fact, Fisher's criticism is not as incriminatory as it might seem. If you read his paper, the entire paper, it's very, in it he praises Mendel quite frequently, particularly at the end where he concludes, experimental research, refers to Mendel's results as experimental researches, conclusive in their results, faultlessly lucid in presentation, and vital to the understanding of not one problem of current interest, but of many. Obviously, Fisher greatly respected Mendel despite this, what he called the abominable discovery that Mendel's results appeared to be too good to be true. Unfortunately, not all scientists were as, or historians have been as laudatory of Mendel as Fisher was. Mendel was included in this book by William Broad and Nicholas Wade, Betrayers of the Truth. He was featured in an article called Great Fakes of Science, and in this book, Science, Good, Bad, and Bogus, and then the article down here, Too Many Chi-Squares or Hanky-Panky in the Monastery, implying that the results were just too good, that Mendel must have somehow faked them or falsified them. And so the director of the Mendel Museum, Vyacheslav Orel, I think said quite appropriately, these selected examples show how great scientific achievements can be discredited by dilettantes who claim a combination of two incompatibilities, the rigorousness of a meticulous scientist and the falsification of results. Well, to address this issue, there were 5 of us who tackled it. Alan Franklin at the University of Colorado was the lead on this, and he contacted the 4 of us and brought us together and said, let's put our heads together and really tackle the Mendel-Fisher controversy. And we initially titled this book The Mendel-Fisher Controversy, but after we had worked with one another and worked through all of the data and done our research, we unanimously agreed that the appropriate title was Ending the Mendel-Fisher Controversy. And in the book, in his opening essay, Alan Franklin stated it's time to end the controversy. And fortunately, most scientists have heeded that plea. And even though not every question about it is answered, there are very reasonable explanations for the Mendel-Fisher controversy, which for the sake of time I won't go into, but they're botanical, they're statistical, mathematical. And the one I will highlight, though, is that Mendel in his paper very clearly stated that he conducted many more experiments than the ones that he presented. And that this was, the presentation was mostly to highlight what he had done. And so I think most of us, if we were highlighting our work, we would choose the best results. And that was probably one of the main reasons why they appear to be too good to be true, is that there was a lot of unpublished data that Mendel didn't include. And not that he hid it, he stated as much in the paper. And also very fascinating is the fact that the Mendel-Fisher controversy really began in earnest, not with Fisher's paper, but in 1965 at the centennial of Mendel's presentation. And Gregory Radek at the University of Leeds has shown what I think is some really phenomenal historical information to show that the Cold War was what prompted the Mendel-Fisher controversy, which really became a controversy in 1965. This book is scheduled to come out in January. I strongly urge you to read it if you're interested in the Mendel-Fisher controversy, because in it, Dr. Radek does, I think, a marvelous job of showing how the Cold War was related to this controversy. So I'll go ahead and end here. I won't read through all of the acknowledgments, only to say that this sort of work cannot be done in isolation, and I have been very fortunate to have wonderful collaborators who have worked with me, several of them in the city of Brno, is the way it's pronounced, and also in Hinchitze, and in Vienna in the UK, and then a large number of researchers collaborating with me at several institutions in the United States, and I'm very grateful to them. And so with that, thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take questions.
So we do have an online audience. We're taking questions from people online as well. I'm going to have this mic for people to ask questions here so that those online can listen here.
Yeah, and also just so you're aware, I do have Menieres disease, which causes pretty severe hearing loss. And I have hearing aids, but I can't always hear questions. Please do not hesitate to answer them, but I may ask Peter to repeat it for me.
First thing I would like you to, I've been involved in debates about Mendel which continue accusing him of fraud, which I vehemently disagree with. But part of it is based on the fact that he focused on 7 traits that indeed did segregate independently, and there are others that do not, because I think the explanation, why didn't he publish more? Because he didn't understand things fully, and we all do that. So I wonder if part of the controversy, you mentioned the Cold War, but is some of the controversy also that he was a religious figure? Okay, and the second question is much more trivial. Probably this, I'm guessing I know the answer, but do we know what genes he was actually studying? Have they been identified?
Yeah, those are excellent. So the two questions, the first one has to do with Mendel. Why did he focus just on 7 characteristics? Mendel answered that question in his paper. He stated that he looked at other characters, several of which behaved like these, and also others that he said were a more or less, rather than an either or. And he specifically selected characters where he could be certain that he could classify them in that kind of an either or sort of thing. But he even stated in the paper that there is every reason to believe that the same principles that apply to these very discrete characters also apply to those that are less well-defined. And I'm paraphrasing, of course, in that. And then also with 7 characters that assorted independently, certainly had he looked at enough, he would have observed what we now call linkage, which is where 2 genes are on the same chromosome and therefore the variants tend to be inherited with one another. And some people, in a way of even accusing Mendel of fraud, have said that he studied 7 pairs of characters and the pea plant has 7 pairs of chromosomes. How could he be so lucky to get 1 pair on each set of chromosomes? Well, the genes and this answers the second question, which is, are the genes known? And the answer is yes, they are. And in fact, not only that, several of them have been sequenced, and the actual DNA variant that Mendel studied is now known. And it turned out that it was not 1 gene per chromosome. There was one case where there were 2 that were on the same chromosome, but they were far enough apart that crossovers were frequent enough that they still segregated independently. And then there was one possibility with plant height and it was plant height and pod shape, where if he used one particular gene for pod shape, it was located close enough that he might have observed linkage. But we know from his results, and I'm getting into a little bit of a technical aspect here with genetics, that linkage can be in either what we call repulsion, where it's inherited, where one version is inherited from one parent and one from the other, or inherited together in what we call coupling. And Mendel studied these in repulsion, where it is more difficult to detect linkage rather than the coupling situation. But we don't know with that one gene whether it was one of the linked genes or whether it was on another chromosome. That's one of those that hasn't been definitively assigned. And so, but the bottom line is that even with linked genes, they have to be very close to detect linkage. Even on the same chromosome, they can assort independently. And so it's no surprise that Mendel observed independent assortment. For geneticists to do a genetic map and identify linkage, they have to look at very large numbers of different genes.
So a quick question from the online audience first, and then I'll go to you. So Adi Tigalar says, did Mendel's religious views change or evolve throughout his life as a scientist? Did he face any pressure in this area, whether from scientists or other religious?
So in terms of evolution, or?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So did, you know, as Mendel as a priest who was studying evolution, obviously, and in fact, there's an interesting case here because in our paper we translated the German term Entwickelt as evolved, or actually Entwicklungsgeschichte as evolutionary history, but it could also be translated from German as developmental history or development. And some authors have translated Mendel's as evolutionary history or developmental history. We feel justified in doing it because our translation was in translating it as evolutionary history, because Darwin only used the word evolution once in Origin of Species as literally the last word of the book, in past participle form as evolved, which in Mendel's version was translated as Entwickelt, which means developed or evolved. And what's that?
Only in the 6th edition.
Actually, no, it's the 3rd edition. Yeah, that's Mendel's was is the 2nd edition German from the 3rd edition English, published in 1863. But it's and so based on that, and in fact our translation is in a sense Darwinized, because as much as possible we looked at, knowing that Mendel was reading Origin of Species at the time he was preparing his paper, we as much as possible used Darwin's English that corresponded to Mendel's German words in his copy of Origin of Species. So our translation is in a sense Darwinized. And, but it's very clear that studying with Unger, the nature of his descriptions in his classic paper, but also especially in his letters to Nageli, it's very clear that he's looking at Darwin's results. And so the question comes up, how did Mendel handle this as a Catholic priest? And we don't really have a lot of first-hand evidence, but we know he faced it in Vienna, because he was studying with Unger, whom Sebastian Brunner referred to in a publication as the high priest of Isis, for his, and stated that he never said, you know, he hardly ever sets foot in a church, and nature is his temple. And interestingly, the article that includes that was published 2 days after Mendel arrived in Vienna to study with Unger. And so clearly, Mendel must have been in an awkward position with this very public evolution-religion debate going on, and yet we have no idea how he managed it, but we do know that he highly respected Unger. But we do have from his nephews this fact that the quotation that I read to you, that Mendel, they stated, his nephews who were close with him at the time in the latter years of his life, stated that he greatly admired Darwin, and even though he had some disagreements with him, and but that he couldn't publish much of his evolutionary research because of clerical enemies, and that he had hoped that his nephews would publish those papers after his death. But at the same time, every piece of evidence that we have indicates that Mendel was very devout, very dedicated to his position as abbot, you know, especially in defending the church property against taxation. And then you can get a sense of his religious devotion in those excerpts from that we have from his sermons. So in my sense, I like to think of Mendel as someone who clearly kept science as science and religion as religion. You know, very much in the Stephen Jay Gould mold of non-overlapping magisteria. I think Mendel was probably a good example of someone who did that.
Well, my first question was going to be, why do you think we saw more Darwinian-style keywords as Mendel kept writing? But I think you kind of touched on that. So my second question is, why did they burn all of his papers?
Yeah, these are excellent questions, and I will take a little bit of time with the first one. Why did we see more Darwinian influence toward the end of Mendel's paper and not so much at the beginning? And it seems to me there are two reasons which are not mutually exclusive. One is that at the beginning of the paper, Mendel takes, I think, a very reasonable approach where he presents his results and the mathematical patterns that he's seen from them without interpreting what the underlying cause is. And so the first part of his paper is mostly presentation of results. It's not unlike current scientific publications where we have an introduction, which Mendel has, in which he, by the way, it's in the first page right at the very beginning where he mentions evolutionary history and refers to his experiments as being very important for understanding that. And then he gives his materials and methods, and then he presents his results, and that's where the first lecture ends. And then in the second lecture, which is toward the end of his paper, is where he delves into the theory, and it's only toward the end that he really gets into the area that is Darwinian. So he may well have postponed that discussion intentionally until then. Also, we have to recognize that he received his copy of Origin of Species in 1863, which was the last year of his experiments. So it obviously could not have influenced the design of his experiments, but it certainly, he was writing his paper then from 1863 to January of 1865. So mostly during 1864, probably reading Origin of Species at the same time, and very well could have been writing the last part of the paper, and the influence is obvious there. If you'd like to read the details about it, we published an article in 2016 titled Darwin's Influence on Mendel, Evidence from a New Translation of Mendel's Paper. It's freely available, open access from the journal Genetics, and easy to find if you'd like to read that. And I also published an article called Mendel and Darwin, Untangling a Persistent Enigma in the journal Heredity in 2020. And so those two articles can go into detail on some of those. And then remind me, the second question was? Why did they burn all his stuff? Yeah, why did they burn all of his papers? And many people have speculated about that. We don't even have, the only account we have of it being burned was a young friar who greatly admired his abbot. And, but even the materials that remained, many of those ended up being lost or destroyed during World War II. And so a lot of what's is missing there, but we really don't know why. It may have been that the abbot, the person elected abbot after Mendel, had been Mendel's friend, but ultimately became had some animosity toward him. But that may not be the case because quite a number of months elapsed before Rambazek was his name, was elected as abbot. And so we really don't know why they were burned. It's, it could have been the taxation issue, who knows. It's the unfortunate thing is that nobody has found them. I'm always hoping that the miracle will come about, that somebody will find stuffed in some box somewhere some more papers by Mendel, but so far it hasn't happened.
Bob Richards in the Fishbein Center. Did Mendel read Darwin's Plants and Animals Under Domestication?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I'll tell you about that. Yeah, so the question is, did Mendel read Darwin's Plants and Animals Under Domestication? And the answer is yes. He had a German translation of that as well. And he focused mostly on the second volume, where he had, I'm trying to remember, 57 annotations in it. And the article I just mentioned about Mendel and Darwin untangling a persistent enigma, the appendix to that article, the online appendix to it, shows photographs of Mendel's annotations in there, of all of them. And so that article is available freely online, and so you're welcome to consult it, and you can actually see firsthand what's there. One of the most fascinating of those annotations is one where most of them are in the chapter on pangenesis, which is Darwin's proposal of inheritance, which Darwin called the provisional hypothesis of pangenesis, which gives you some sense of how hesitant Darwin was to claim that it was correct. And in fact, Francis Galton and Darwin himself, often Darwin is not appropriately credited with its demise, but Galton conducted a series of experiments of blood transfusion with rabbits, which pretty much put pangenesis to bed. But Mendel recognized that it was wrong. And at the bottom of a page on pangenesis, he wrote in German on it. He said to succumb to an impression without reflection. And then he had marked parts of the pangenesis where he knew that Darwin was wrong. And interestingly, he also marked some passages where Darwin claimed that at least 3 pollen grains were required for fertilization, indicating this inequality of fertilization. And because of that, Mendel actually conducted some additional experiments, never published, where he took individual pollen grains and put them on the stigmas of flowers to see if a single pollen grain could in fact affect fertilization, and it did. And he never published that. We only know about it because of a letter that he wrote to Carl Nägeli. And in the letter he says, Darwin claims that it's at least 3, but I can show that it's 1. And so it's, that was one of the areas where Mendel disagreed with Darwin, having nothing to do with natural selection, but rather the nature of fertilization and inheritance.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to ask you a question about the reception of Mendel. You mentioned the quotation from Weldon where he talked about crown. Yeah, and that leads me to wonder: is that a sort of an allusion to a tonsure? And if so, is there sort of an underlying, almost sort of anti-Catholic animus behind that, which leads to the broader question: were any of the refusals of Mendel's theory conditioned at all by, say, sectarian polemics? Because after all, Weldon was an Englishman, presumably from an Anglican or an unchurched background.
Yeah, so the question is Mendel's, the fact that Mendel was an Augustinian friar, did that somehow play into some of the animosity, particularly with Weldon, who was an Englishman? And I should mention that quotation about his shaven crown is not public. It was not. He didn't publish that. He wrote that in a personal letter to his colleague. What is his name slipping my mind? Pearson, Carl Pearson. And so it was in a letter, and also he crossed it out. But it was still legible, so we still have the letter with that in there. But the shaven crown is, of course, an allusion to a friar, which Mendel never shaved his crown. But it was obviously a religious slur in a sense, and so did the fact that Mendel was a friar, was that did that lead to bias? And the answer is probably yes, later, not during his lifetime. He was very well respected by scientists. You know, his election to this prestigious society in Vienna, he was one of the founding members of the Natural Science Society in Brno, where he worked very closely with other scientists who were very prominent and who worked with him, even co-authored things with him. He was elected to be the vice president of the society later on when he was abbot. And so there was, during his lifetime, there's no evidence that there was any disrespect whatsoever. And in fact, if anything, it was the reverse. The friars in Brno were from a very learned society or learned order, and they taught in the local schools, and the abbot encouraged them to do secular, scientific, and philosophical and artistic research. And so no indication that during his lifetime, but certainly after. And then where it became really prominent was during the Soviet phase, when Brno is just inside Czechoslovakia. It's only about, I think maybe 70 miles north of Vienna. But Mendel was substantially discredited in his homeland, and part of that was because of Lysenko, but I think also, and I've heard this from quite a number of people who were alive during the communist era in Czechoslovakia, who have said that Mendel was ignored because he was a priest, and because of the rejection of Catholicism during the Soviet bloc during that the period of communism. So the answer to your question, with some explanation, is indeed yes.
Time for one more quick question. I think we have one from the online audience that Michael Chevalier can raise.
So we have a question from Kathleen Kwasi. What is the current perspective on Mendel's work and its use to support eugenics, given that Bateman's apparent support of eugenics? Darwin also had apparently prominent role in providing a theoretical bridge between race scientists and eugenics. And Darwin and Galton apparently had a virulent anti-Judeo-Christian stance.
So the question has to do with eugenics and the use of Mendelian inheritance. We have absolutely nothing from Mendel regarding eugenics. In fact, he didn't address inheritance in any other species other than flowering plants. And so we can't attribute eugenics in any way directly to Mendel. The word itself, however, comes from Galton, who was Darwin's cousin, and who invented the term eugenics. And at the time of Mendel's rediscovery, it's interesting that just about every textbook of the early textbooks on genetics ends with a chapter on eugenics promoting it. And including Bateson's book and also Reginald Punnett's book on genetics, and then Mendel's results were once they were discovered, and it was 1902 when the first Mendelian inheritance in humans was discovered. And so as a consequence, eugenics based on Mendelism was very prominent in the early part of the 20th century. And Mendelian inheritance was in fact used for that. Feeble-mindedness was one of the most prominent characteristics, and it was Charles Davenport in the United States proposed that it was a Mendelian recessive allele or variant that in the homozygous condition, inherited from both parents, caused feeble-mindedness. And the famous Supreme Court case in which Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. stated that, and I'll have to paraphrase, but that compulsory vaccination laws are sufficient to warrant the cutting of fallopian tubes, and that 3 generations of imbeciles is enough, resulting in the sterilization, involuntary sterilization of 60,000 people in the United States and more than 400,000 in Nazi Germany. And it was, and then of course the extreme eugenics under Nazism was what ultimately led to its downfall. But I should mention that there were prominent geneticists at the time arguing against eugenics. The foremost among them was Thomas Hunt Morgan, who was the leading American Mendelian or eugenicist, or geneticist, not eugenicist. He was an anti-eugenicist. And he argued very strongly against it, as did a number of others. And Edward East at Harvard, who himself was not so critical of genetics, showed pretty straightforwardly that even if feeble-mindedness was due to a recessive variant, that any kind of eugenic action to prevent people from reproducing who had it would have a negligible effect. In other words, selection against a recessive allele in genetic terms is minimal, and except over many generations, especially if it's present at a low frequency as they had proposed. They were proposing it was about 3% of people carried it. And East showed that eugenics would have no effect whatsoever with it. And so so there was plenty of criticism of eugenics even at the time it was being promoted. But certainly Mendel was, his results were used to justify it by the eugenicists.
So we are running out of time. So I want to take the time to thank Daniel Fairbanks again for coming to give this talk. I want to thank our co-sponsors, the Morris Fishbein Center, the Seminary Co-op bookstore. Again, Professor Fairbanks' book is available for purchase in the back of the room here. Please stay around. We will have some food and drink for a small reception. And again, thank you for coming. And thank you again, Professor Fairbanks.
Oh, and thank you so much for inviting me. I very much appreciate it.